It's Jeremy Camp, Word of Life. On Vision Christian Radio, it's Neil with you, the Thursday edition of 2020. Shortly, we'll create perhaps what might be a limited opportunity today as we open our talkback lines. Don't let that stop you from making a call and making a contribution to our conversation. But we're going to be discussing understanding the looming energy crisis and a transition to renewable energy. You might know that energy ministers from around Australia are meeting today ahead of a critical National Cabinet meeting that's been rescheduled for tomorrow. Rescheduled, the National Cabinet meeting was postponed because the Prime Minister's got COVID. Well, they're meeting to discuss Australia's energy crisis, desperate for ways to ease the rising cost of power and avert what might be a real tragedy. Well, this hour, we'll be hoping to cut through the politics on Australia's transition to renewable energy. You'll know from your latest power bill that we're all paying more for power, and it bites even harder when the viability of business, industry and manufacturing is under threat. Well, three special guests joining our panel today to discuss the evolving crisis as it stands. Emeritus Professor Rod St Hill, Christian economist with a background in banking and higher education. These days he's a pastor leading a church on the Gold Coast called Ignite Life. Russell Huskisson is joining us too, a former production officer in a Queensland power station, incidentally also a member of the Vision Radio Board. And Mark Patterson is joining us. Mark is a power systems architecture specialist. He's Managing Director of Stratagen Australia. He's designed an action plan for Australia based on best practice around the world. Let me just welcome each of our guests. First of all, Rod St Hill, welcome to you.
Great to be with you again.
Russell Hutchison, welcome to you.
Yeah, how are you today, Neil?
Well, thank you. And Mark Patterson, a special welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. And just confirming that today I'm keen to speak as a private citizen, not so much on behalf of our organisation, but certainly as a Christian. So thanks for the opportunity.
And certainly thank you so much for being available. And yes, certainly as a private citizen, as we're into all sorts of depth here in the conversation we're going to have, and even looking for those Christian dimensions by which we can apply a Christian lens to the challenge and the crisis that we may be facing. Let me just come to Rod St Hill first. As we get this conversation underway, Rod, a looming energy crisis, a key driver in the cost of living pressures. Every single listener to us right now is in some sense a victim of those rising prices. How do you see the challenge that's ahead?
Well, I don't want to be too controversial to start with, Neil, but I don't think we have an energy crisis. We have a price crisis, and it's been brought on by government policy, pure and simple.
Okay, that's a very good, let's cut through there and say it's actually not an energy crisis, it's a price crisis. It is a price crisis that's pushing up the cost of living, and if you're at that lower socioeconomic level, you're really feeling the pinch right now. A very quick comment on the key driver from our other guests. Russell Huskisson, what are your thoughts on energy being a key driver in our cost of living pressures?
Yeah, I probably agree with what Rod just said as an opening remark, because the government has been playing in the energy space, and all governments have been playing in the energy space for a long time, and now we're starting to see some of the fruits of that.
Okay, and Mark, your thoughts on the crisis? I mean, from where you sit, having the exploration of all of the biggest models around the world and how that's all a part of this transition, how do you see this? Is it a crisis? Is the word overblown?
Sure. Look, I think it'd be a boring discussion if we all agreed on everything, wouldn't it? And I think as Christians, that's where we can have debates in a collegiate way. I think there's truth in what my colleagues have said. I would probably put it a bit differently, and that is that when you transition some of the world's largest systems that have ever been created by humans, and you transition them very dramatically for a whole range of reasons, not least the global desire to kind of reduce dependence on carbon, then invariably systems that have been around for 100 years, they're going to go into a period of very profound challenges and transformational forces. So I think for me the question is there's a ton of trade-offs that we need to make as societies, and I think making the most intelligent trade-off decisions to get the right balance between the laws of physics and the laws of economics, I think is one of the big challenges and opportunities here.
Just to touch on your expertise here for a moment, Mark, you've reviewed 20 global initiatives to evaluate how power systems may need to change to enable the net zero emissions future, and you came up with an action plan for Australia. And no doubt the action plan takes the best of what you've discovered around the world. Just describe for us the sort of work that you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for that. So in short, and again, I won't bore you with too much detail, but other than to say that it's like any super complex system. In fact, the grid is technically referred to as an ultra-large complex system. So it's literally is one of the largest, most complex things humans have ever created. In that respect, speaking as a Christian, it actually, for me, I find it very exciting because it reflects something of the complexity of who God is as an intelligent creator. But I think the sort of core of what I've had the privilege of doing is really working with what they call systems architecture disciplines to really understand how all the many different parts of the system, generation, transmission, distribution, retail services, customer technologies, how all of that can actually function together as a much more integrated and self-optimizing system is really the focus, which goes back to one of the points that Rod makes, is that if we can either go about, in a sense, transition in a dumb way, which is we just keep throwing money at things and we keep doing things we've done for the last 100 years, thinking they'll work for the next 100. I would consider that a pretty dumb approach. But getting the economics right, as the two other speakers have mentioned, is always going to be a balancing act with a number of other technology elements and enablers.
That's a really wise insight, isn't it? If you talk about the 100 years past, how do we think about the 100 years future? And Russell Huskisson, as someone who's been a part of the power industry for a long, long time, this 100 years development of infrastructure to the current time, I know you've expressed some concerns at different times about the rate of change and just how fast this is happening, replacing a 100-year infrastructure with something that needs to be very carefully looked at. What are your thoughts for 100 years past and even perhaps where things might need to move for 100 years future?
Exactly what Mark said. It is very, very complex. And in that complexity that has built up over 100 years, and 100 years of infrastructure and 100 years of knowledge into that infrastructure has made it very, very complex. And when you start then moving things around the edges and then moving things in major ways, it then opens up lots of other issues and potential things that can and cannot go wrong.
Okay, we'll no doubt discuss some of those things that can and can't go wrong and the possibilities of even some safeguards that we might put in place with those. Come back to this price crisis though. Rod St Hill, sometimes we talk about what's happening right now. This price crisis, everyone wants to allocate blame somewhere else. But there's described as a self-inflicted wound that's happening, and both sides of government to blame.
Well, yeah, it is to a large extent inflicted upon us by government policy, but governments are supposed to represent community, and there certainly is concern within the community about the environmental impacts of our current methods of producing electricity. So we do need to recognise that. The real issue from my perspective is how we make this transition and how we actually recognise that it will truly be very costful for Australia. The reason being, God has endowed us with resources that automatically lean us towards being what's called a high carbon economy. We have a lot of coal and a lot of gas. We have a very large country most of our agricultural land is suitable only for grazing, and so we've got animals contributing methane gas and so on. We also have large distances, which means that there's a lot of transport costs built into the infrastructure that serves us by getting things to supermarkets and so on. Now, that's what we call comparative advantage in economics. Australia's comparative advantage is actually in fossil fuels, grazing of animals, and then our handicap, if you like, is very large distances between the major population areas. So we're naturally a high carbon economy. Moving away from that is going to be far more expensive than it will be for other economies, which are configured in very different ways to Australia. So as a Christian economist, I believe I have a role in helping us as a nation use the resources that God has given us in a way that creates human flourishing to the maximum extent possible. And that, in fact, is what economics is all about.
Well, a high carbon economy and seeing that as God's blessing. Well, all of the protesters against the carbon outputs of Australia don't like that idea at all. The fact that we're a high carbon economy, because they're trying to close it down in that sense. Mark, if we're talking about Australia and our natural assets, as Rod describes them, can you create an infrastructure that sort of pleases both sides, that can meet the needs both ways? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, look, I think so. Maybe building on some aspects of what Rob was just saying, and also maybe sharing some other views on that. I guess I would agree that we need to, respect and honour what resources we have, and we absolutely, stewardship is a critical concept in Christianity, and in fact, I think the original Greek word, if I'm not mistaken, underpinning economics is stewardship. So it's a pretty honourable area in its traditional sense. I guess the way I would think about this is we absolutely have many of the resources that Rod mentioned. We also endowed with many renewable resources as well, and obviously the continent of Australia is lightly populated by global standards, has absolutely huge capacity for renewable energy resources, and right now we're doing work with the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation on transitioning many islander grids to low carbon futures, and in many cases those communities end up becoming much more cost effective because they're no longer dependent on diesel and other high cost, high risk fuels. In a lot of ways, people are looking at Australia as an amazing context in which those solutions are being created. So I think there's a whole range of different resources that we need to look at, and I would simply put it this way, that with regard to energy transition, we all would love simple solutions. Einstein said everything should be as simple as possible and no simpler. And while we would all look for a silver bullet, what we actually need here is silver buckshot.
Well, great insights. And you've raised something very important. The thought that when we talk about Australia's energy crisis or price crisis, we're concentrating our thoughts on Australia alone. But, Mark, you take things to a new level when you bring in Australia's place as a global citizen and, in some sense, some equity issues around what happens in developing nations who haven't had the cheap electricity resources that Australia has had, and how they might well continue to benefit from those into the future. I'll come to Rod St Hill. Rod, when we talk about Australia as a global citizen, sometimes it is interesting, isn't it, that we limit ourselves to only thinking about our own backyard, but there might be a whole lot of developing nations in the world reliant on how we deal with our fossil fuels and all of these, coal and gas.
Well, certainly that's part of it, and generally speaking, Australia's thermal coal is relatively clean coal. Much cleaner than that is available in many other countries. So that's one contribution we could make, actually, is to do what we're doing now, which is to export our relatively clean coal overseas. The other thing too is we're a relatively wealthy nation, and so other countries could look to us to develop technologies. And I don't think we've talked enough about technologies in the public debate. So, for example, it's now possible to generate electricity at less than 100 grams per kilowatt hour of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents using thermal, nuclear, solar or wind power. And I think the whole lot should be in the mix. When we look at technology, there's no reason why we shouldn't be harnessing all of our resources. And I love the that comment that Mark made that we need a blunderbuss or a shotgun approach. And I actually agree with that. I think it's wrong for us to focus on 100% renewables or even 82% renewables by 2030 as we currently are, given the fact that we're going to be investing more than $100 billion in renewables between now and 2030, and that we should be looking at harnessing all these different types of energy, and we can do it relatively cleanly. The big issue, I think, actually is cost, and it's very, very difficult to get what I would consider to be a really accurate handle on costs. I think we know much more about carbon dioxide pollution than we know about the actual cost of the various technologies at the moment.
We're going to continue our conversation. I do want to open our talkback lines. If you do have a contribution, a question, you'll need to be quick with that, but we will put that through our panel and get their responses to it. If you do have a question, our three special guests on our panel, Emeritus Professor Rod St Hill, Russell Huskisson and Mark Patterson. Mark is a Power Systems Architecture Specialist. We're back with more in just a few moments. Well, our conversation is about our looming energy crisis. A panel assembled today. Three guests on our panel. Emeritus Professor Dr. Rod St Hill, Russell Huskisson, a former production officer in a Queensland power station, and Mark Patterson, who is a Power Systems Architecture Specialist. And our special guests today, let's see if we can bring a scenario of where costs might be really, really significant in a blowout over the years to come. I know that Russell Huskisson, you've expressed some concerns about what happens when we all end up with an electric car. Now, that'd be nice to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden we all have an electric car, but there's some big challenges that come around that with our energy provision. What are your concerns there, Russell?
Probably the concerns. I don't think that everyone will have an electric car because of the vast distances that we have in Australia. But the concerns are around about the distribution of electricity to every household. Currently, if you go up onto the Ergon website, they'll tell you for a subdivision that they allocate 5 kilowatts drop per house or per lot in that subdivision. And if we start plugging in cars that want well in excess of 35 kilowatts, 35 kilowatts, some on a fast charge will want 50 kilowatts. The design structure not only in the street, but the feeding transformers and everything else back to the substations, and then the substations back into the generation, all that has to be changed.
Okay, Mark Patterson, you've looked at models all around the world. Is anything we are doing and planning to do going to be able to meet the huge needs simply if lots of people in our street have an electric car?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks. I think good comments, and I think this is a really valid example of what I would call either we can approach these things in a sort of pretty dumb way as a nation, or we can actually confront the brutal facts about emerging challenges, and then look at are there opportunities to turn them into opportunities for the nation. And this is a great example in the sense that if we just have unmanaged charging of electric vehicles, then exactly the kind of situation that Russell's highlighting is absolutely going to happen. Alternatively, one of the big challenges that we have in a decarbonising power system is that in the middle of the day, typically they have what is called minimum demand, where you've got an oversupply of renewable energy from solar in particular, often because there's lower levels of load on the system in the middle of the day. So that actually creates a whole bunch of other problems for the system. So if you put those two things together through smart intelligence, and this is happening around the world, and Australia is working on aspects of this, then you can actually get the best of both worlds, where you can actually use that oversupply of cheaper renewable energy that's currently creating problems for the system. If you actually align your electric vehicle charging through automation to maximise the use of that cheaper renewable energy, then you can certainly mitigate some of those impacts, the extremity. But I think at the end of the day, as I said, we can do this in dumb ways, and sometimes, unfortunately, we do, or we can actually do them in more intelligent, thoughtful ways. Again, speaking as a Christian, that is actually what we're meant to be doing. We're meant to be bringing ethics, we're meant to be bringing intelligence, and really helping have a constructive public debate about the real issues that we need to confront, and not just the window dressing.
Not standing back, just being the critic, but getting in the game and offering really powerful and intelligent alternatives. In fact, as I understand it, Australia's energy ministers are expected to sign off on a scheme to accelerate the take-up of giant batteries to support decarbonisation and the growth of the grid. Just quickly back to you, Mark, is that something that is part of the plan? Mark, are you with us? Rod St Hill, are you familiar with that thought of, there's one potential alternative, giant batteries?
Oh, yes, giant batteries have been in the mix for a while, as has pumped hydro as well. Storing water and using it to create electricity through a hydro plant is another way of actually storing electricity. We're going to have these as part of the system because, as everybody knows, wind and solar are unreliable in the sense that, well, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow. So we have to have this as part of the architecture of our system.
Let's squeeze in a call or two. John is in Wangaratta in Victoria. Hi, John. Welcome along.
Good morning. Look, really, we're creating a huge problem for ourselves. Australian society needs baseload power 24/7, every minute of the day, and we're trying to feed in renewables that, as has just been said, the sun only shines for 9 hours a day in the winter. That's the fuel for solar power. So for other 15 hours of the day, you've got no power from solar. And for wind, it's intermittent, and wind turbines are only actually turn out to be producing power 25% of their rated capacity. So we just can't. I think the way to solve this problem is that for the Australian Energy organisation that organises things, is to get companies to bid to provide power for 24 hours a day. And if the company can't provide power for the 25 hours, 24/7, then they don't accept their bids.
That's an interesting point that you're making there. And if I come to Mark Patterson, Mark, if you put that responsibility on the shoulders of companies who provide power, they need to be able to meet the needs. I think we're all worried about whether they're able to do that, but is it going to be possible to meet that need? What are your thoughts here for John? I think we might have difficulty with Mark there for a moment. Russell Huskisson, do you have any thoughts here for John?
Yeah, John makes a relative point that, we're all used to going and just plugging our device into the wall, and there's always been power there. Due to except for some storm event, power has always been there for us, and we're used to that now as a society. And just like we said before, Rod mentioned about pump storage, hydro storage, like there's one on the Wivenhoe Dam. They're great for being able to turn on and to be able to produce power so you can pump solar into the dam, then theoretically get it back. But even some of those around are going to be hard because of our geographical sense that we have in Australia, that we don't have a lot of mountains that we can put a dam on the top of.
John in Wangaratta, thank you so much for your call. We're going to news and continuing our conversation after Vision National News. We've got our assembled expert panel and we're talking through the energy crisis, or the price crisis as it's been described. You might like to participate. You'll be able to on 1800 316 316. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Thursday edition of 2020. We're in the deep end today. If you're just joining us, trying to understand the looming energy crisis or looming price crisis and how we might think about those things deeply as Christian believers. You might know that energy ministers from around Australia are meeting today ahead of a critical national cabinet meeting rescheduled for tomorrow. Albo's got COVID. They put it off till tomorrow, but they're meeting to discuss Australia's energy crisis, and they are desperate for ways to ease the rising cost of power, which is fueling the cost of living crisis we are all experiencing. Well, this hour we're hoping to cut through the politics on Australia's transition to renewable energy. You'll know from your latest power bill that we are all paying more for power, and it bites even harder when the viability of business, industry and manufacturers is under threat, and as is the jobs that we all might have in those industries. Three very special guests on our panel: Emeritus Professor Rod St Hill, who's a Christian economist; Russell Huskisson, a former production officer in a Queensland power station; and Mark Patterson, who is a power systems architecture specialist. He's Managing Director of Stratagen Australia and has designed an action plan for Australia based on best practice around the world. Now, gentlemen, before we move on, and there's some really important points to move to, but before we do, why don't we take another call from a listener? Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Richard, welcome along.
G'day, guys.
Richard, what are your thoughts?
The question I had, or the two questions I want to encapsulate into one, they're talking about, clean green future with energy. But number one being, this is all mined material. How do they get rid of it cleanly in the end? With nuclear, they've got new techniques of disposing of the old spent fuel rods and things like that. And the other one is, I've heard a bit about, I think, is it Xinjiang province in China, and basically they could be using slave labour, the Uyghurs and the Hong Kong prisoners, to make solar panels. I don't know what you guys know about that stuff.
Yep. Certainly issues around fair trade, where all of the infrastructure is actually manufactured before it even gets here, and the ethical questions around that. Those things are very important. Let me come to Rod St Hill for a brief response first, then I'll come to Mark Patterson.
Yes, two very good points. But in relation to being able to decommission cleanly, there are lots of new technologies developing which I think will make that a lot easier in the future, but that doesn't mean to say it's not important. The other one is the whole issue of modern slavery. It is almost certain that modern slavery is involved in the production of solar panels. We have legislation in place, and it applies to companies. I think it should also apply to the government when it's framing policy. But I think that could potentially be a very serious problem for us.
Mark, any thoughts here for Richard from Alstonville?
Sure, just very briefly. I didn't quite catch the first part, but I know it was about nuclear. On the second point, I think agree with the comments Rod just made, and I think at the end of the day, this is not unique to any particular sector. This is, the topic of modern slavery is obviously across many different areas, including textiles and so on. So I would agree that the same principles apply in terms of how we deal with that in this as well as other sectors. On nuclear, I think one of the things that often gets missed around its role in the transition is the fact that the transition is not only about new sources of generation, and for that matter, new centralised sources of generation. One of the realities is that, to use the fancy word, one of the major trends that's happening in power systems like Australia is what they call decentralisation. So the fact that by 2050, in the order of 30 to 50% of our generation capacity will actually be coming from the polar opposite end of the system from its original design, i.e. from our rooftop, from the rooftops of commercial buildings and so on. And so our major need is not necessarily major new sources of centralised generation only, albeit that's not to say that nuclear couldn't play a role. It just needs to be understood in its wider context.
Richard from Alstonville, thank you so much for your call. Let's squeeze another call in before we move on. Bill is in Victoria. Hi, Bill. Welcome along.
Hello, Neil. Thank you, Neil. Rodson, Russell and Michael, thank you very much for that. We're just wondering, in terms of you mentioning there's an environmental impact, climate cost, that type of thing, to do with the fossil fuel. I understand that Donald Trump, who's a Christian, he says that that's all fake news. You guys as Christians are saying that there is an impact. Can you please explain what's going on?
Interestingly, we haven't raised a whole lot around environmental issues here. So, Bill, you might be leading into something that hasn't been said in this conversation, because we've determined not to make it a climate change style conversation, neither to necessarily demonise those political figures, whether they be in Australia or around the world. But just a quick, perhaps, a response. Rod St Hill, what are your thoughts around, demonising particular ones?
Yeah, look, I guess two things are important for us to recognise. Per capita, Australia has the most highly carbonised economy in the world. But in terms of our total contribution to greenhouse gas equivalent emissions, we have very little impact at all. So what we do as a nation won't make much difference globally. We've commented earlier, I think, on the ethical case for Australia being involved as a global citizen, and I think that does carry some weight. There's no doubt, for example, that thermal generation, as we do it right now, does emit carbon dioxide and other gases. That's undeniable. Technology has been able to make significant improvements there. There are issues, for example, with things like wind turbines. Again, I've seen very recently that there are efforts to make the blades using timber. In the Nordic countries, experiments are going on there now. So we have to be really careful about framing any debate in the context of the world as it is today, and we need to look forward as well.
Bill, thank you so much for your call, and our talkback line will remain open on 1800 316 316, but some important ground that we do want to follow up on with our special guests, and really just following on from that conversation, the implications around other developing economies linking to international development. And Rod St Hill, you've made some comments around the thought that we don't want to necessarily demonise coal, but you don't want to pedestalise coal either and say coal is the only alternative we ought to be relying on instead of pursuing this costly change. Because you've indicated even pollution that's caused from fossil fuels, not just carbon dioxide, which some people say is not pollution at all, although it's categorised as that, but a lot of people who are actually dying from the pollution that is caused by the power generation. Any thoughts here on the effects on people and their lifestyles and their health because of these issues?
Look, yes. There's no doubt that thermal generation of electricity does have some impact on lives, and there's research, quite robust research, that demonstrates that. The effects are relatively small, but they exist nevertheless, and the more you move towards renewables, the less those impacts are. In some countries, a move from, say, using dung or wood as a source of fuel for cooking, moving from there to, say, LPG cylinders will have significant impacts on health. For example, using dung as a cooking fuel is roughly equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. So we can make a significant contribution, I think, by thinking intelligently about how we make a transition from certain fuels to certain other sources of energy.
And we're going to lose Russell Huskisson in just a short while. Russell, any contribution from you around just coming back to, as Mark indicated just a little earlier, a decentralising of the way we actually provide energy, that our homes will have solar panels on the roofs and will almost be self-sustaining, the centralised idea that we have in our own minds, and maybe that's not something we can overcome in international situations where those who are poor and suffering will be looking forward to having that centralised capacity of power generation. But any thoughts further from you here, Russell?
Yeah, I think as Christians, we always have to be mindful that we're put on this earth to be good stewards. And over the years, that we've had a really great run on coal. Let's face it. You know, one of the reasons that Australia is so rich as a nation is because of coal. But there needs to be a change, and as we've said before, there's not only one thing in the mix. Solar, wind, and nuclear will probably get there, and eventually it will be, you know, if we can ever solve the problem, fusion may even get there. But it's the transition that we need to make to be better stewards. Now, whether we believe in climate change or not is not part of the debate for me. It's all about how we can be better citizens on this earth and how we can be better stewards on this earth.
Well, Russell Huskisson, thank you so much for your contribution in our panel today. I know that you've got to leave us, so we'll thank you very much, and we'll let you go, but appreciate your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. Mark, let me come to you. Even as Russell's recognising, you know, coal, solar, wind, nuclear, even he's talking about new technologies, fusion that might well come into the mix later on. What most people are concerned about is that in the transition to all of these new renewables, that jobs will be lost, that towns could wither and die. Are there issues around, and perhaps you've had some thoughts here, and I'll come to Rod St Hill as the economist in just a moment, but are there going to be enough jobs? Will there be more jobs in the new energy future than there has been in the past? What are your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. So I think, most recently we did some work on what's known as just transition, which is the whole area of looking at particular towns or regions that have hosted, for example, coal-fired power stations and the impacts on those towns and regions, and how that can actually be anticipated and how that can also be turned into opportunities. I think change is inevitable. That's a reality in the world, and I think, again, speaking as Christians, I think we do live in a society that it's very easy for us to gripe about a lot of things collectively. We can do that as well. We can want things to always stay the same. Reality is things change throughout the years, the decades, and the centuries. And so I think the bigger question is, how do we actually engage with these challenges, changes in ways that are intelligent, that are ethical, that are kind of taking society with us. There's a whole range of new industry development opportunities that we can either actually, in I would say often, sadly, traditional Australian style, wait for other nations to actually lead the innovation and then spend the rest of the time buying those solutions back, or we can actually lead the way with some of that technology development. And I think there's certainly a whole range of new roles in that space. That said, not everyone's going to be able to transition to those roles, and so it's a case of a balanced approach to how do we actually help those communities that may not have the opportunity to directly transfer into those new roles. I think, again, a holistic approach needs to be taken.
And from what I understand, Australia is leading the pack for fast change. Things are happening here faster than other parts of the world. It may be the population of Australia or determination from various sides of politics. Come back to that jobs question and small communities withering and dying because they've been coal towns or gas towns. The transition there. How do we feel about those sorts of issues when you're talking about a clean energy future, Rod?
Well, look, I don't know that this is unique to the so-called clean energy future. There have always been transitions. And over a long period of time, of course, Australia's population has become less and less regional and rural and much more oriented towards the coastal cities. And this is the same in many other parts of the world. And I think we need to learn lessons from the past in terms of how we make these transitions. I mean, I really applaud the work that Mark is doing here in the area of just transition. It is something we do need to plan and to facilitate. And we need also to recognise that the skills needed in the new generation future may not be the same as those that exist at the moment. So, for example, we know we're going to need about 30,000 skilled workers during this transition, but they're not all going to have the same skills as those that exist at the moment. So part of the transition has to be training and education, as well as things associated with relocation and so on.
Let's squeeze in another call. Stuart is in Winslow in Victoria. Hi, Stuart. Welcome.
Good morning. Look, years ago I heard a bloke talking on the fjords of Western Australia, where they had tides of some enormous thing like 5 metres. And these have been roaring up these fjords and in and out since God created the planet. And this would be an enormous hydroelectric scheme. And you could bring the power around by underground, underwater, undersea.
Stuart, you're describing a very interesting and obviously something that there'll be someone who's done some research on that. I might come to Mark Patterson. Mark, tides coming in, tides going out, the capacity there for hydroelectric power. Is this something that's also in the mix when you're talking about the architecture?
Yeah, so again, in the spirit of silver buckshot, there's a whole range of different technologies, including tidal and wave, not tidal wave energy, that are certainly being trialled and developed. I think, as with all of these things, there's a level of complexity in that, and that is, for example, in those areas, often some of the examples that you probably the caller refers to World Heritage areas, and so that presents a whole range of issues with regard to installing that kind of infrastructure. The second thing is that while there's an amazing renewable resource there, as the caller suggested, a significant amount of the cost pressure on electricity prices is actually is not so much just the generation dimension, but it's actually what they call the transport dimension, which is the cost of building and maintaining all of the poles and wires, even undersea cables and so on, which are very expensive as well. So it's, again, looking at this from a whole of system perspective is so essential to really understanding the real costs of any solution, and also whether they're going to be viable at a local and regional level in terms of community impacts, environmental impacts, and so on.
Stuart, thank you so much for your call. We'll put a line under any calls from now because just a few minutes remaining in our conversation. Let me come to the issue of what will it all cost, because come to you here at Rod St Hill as an economist. The cost in a nation like Australia, the poles and wires, the infrastructure that's necessary to completely replace what we already have that's taken 100 years to build. How do you grapple with what that might cost? Because no doubt there's ongoing costs.
There are, and honestly, it's very, very difficult to get an accurate idea of what these costs are. The federal government has announced some $20 billion to build new transmission lines. So it's not so much that we're going to knock down what we've already got. We're going to have to build a whole lot more because the solar and the wind generators are going to be dispersed fairly widely geographically. So we need a lot more transmission wires. They won't be underground because it's far too expensive. And so governments, for example, in New South Wales, are now negotiating with landholders to compensate them for building transmission lines across their property. And that's going to add to the cost. At the moment, it looks as if we're going to spend about $66 billion on large-scale renewable energy plants. That's wind generators and solar farms in the main. There'll be another $27 billion or so spent on rooftop solar. And I certainly hope that a lot of that is on top of office buildings where peak demand is more likely to match peak production. There's a whole sad story about the way in which government subsidies for domestic solar panels were poorly targeted, but that's probably for another day. In addition to that, the government's going to spend about $30 billion in subsidies on renewables between now and 2030. So we're getting somewhere north of $150 billion.
All right, okay. The cost, it is a huge cost. And Mark Patterson, undoubtedly, as you've been exploring the different models around the world, looking for best practice for Australia, cost has got to be consideration in there. How do you deal with the question of what it will cost, both in the initial infrastructure setup, but then the maintenance and then eventual probably replacement, maybe in a couple of decades?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So a couple of quick thoughts. I think the first thing is that as humans, we're very interesting creatures. That is that research has shown that the vast majority of the population want to see action on toward decarbonisation. The problem with that is the same research also highlights that everyone wants that as long as someone else pays for it. So that's a reality we've got to deal with, that if we're going to transition in this direction, then there is a cost, and we do need to work out how we want to pay for that as a society. Second point would be that, one of the key things about the work we have the privilege of doing is that our model of change here is really critical, and that is, how do we actually think about the nature of the problem we're dealing with? If we, in fact, try to keep doing many of the things we did for the 20th century that served us well, and we just keep trying to perpetuate those into the future, just building inordinate amounts of new infrastructure and so on. New infrastructure, expanding capability is certainly part of the puzzle, but a major part of the puzzle that we don't always spend enough time on is applying the 21st century tools to say, what would be the minimum necessary structural and infrastructure changes we might actually need to make, together with intelligence-based solutions, to really get the balance right as to significantly moderating the investment required to actually make an orderly transition over the next two decades in particular.
Well, Mark, in the role that you have, potentially saving the nation billions by the way that you're able to strategically plan through some of these issues, and no doubt you've got a very key role to play in the way that people understand, those who are legislating, those who are making policy and decisions about these things, understanding what is to come over our future. We have run out of time, and do want to just thank our special guests who've taken their time to share these thoughts with us today. Emeritus Professor Rod St Hill, who's a Christian economist, and these days he serves as pastor at the Ignite Life Church on the Gold Coast. You can connect with Rod at ignitelifechurch.com. Mark Patterson, Power Systems Architecture Specialist, Managing Director of Strategy Australia. Mark, appreciate your insights, and especially from our guests over this past hour when we're applying a Christian lens to what's happening in the nation and for an energy future that looks a lot different to what it did in the 20th century. Rod St Hill, thank you for being with us.
You're very welcome.
And Mark Patterson, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks so much.